I guess I came across this problem pretty naturally. Most of my work involves working with teachers, embedded in their classrooms and trying to figure out how they're going to help their students write better. Elizabeth lugs home a canvas bag of student drafts to prepare for student conferences. Earlier in the year, she learned that feedback is a powerful instructional tool to help students master skills and processes. During a recent staff development, her principal shared 4 types of feedback: task, process, self-regulation, and self. The principal explained that teachers must decide where the student is in the learning process and then match the feedback to the student's understanding. Ready to tackle the first class of essays, Elizabeth pulls out a thick manila folder ready for first period's benchmark assessments. She opens the cover and sees Robbie's paper. Spacing, spelling, punctuation, organization. That paper is a mess. Confronted with the realities of Robbie's writing, knowing the 4 levels of feedback is not a bit helpful to Elizabeth. She's not sure how to select a teaching point that will help Robbie the most when she meets with him during tomorrow's workshop session. Elizabeth decides that Robbie's needs are too complex and moves to Cheyenne's paper. Cheyenne has mastered more of the grade level conventions and seems to be going in the right direction with the organization and content of her paper. Elizabeth wants to help Cheyenne reach a new level of sophistication, but it is a loss of where she might prompt next. Elizabeth, frustrated, skims over a few more papers, reviewing what students have written, thinking it would be much easier to get out a red pen and start marking the errors. She knows that that approach would place her as the decision maker and problem solver instead of the writer. Frustrated, she closes the folder, crams it back into the overstuffed bag, and heads to the freezer for ice cream. The next day, she meets with her colleagues during their PLC. She pulls out the stacks of paper, thumping them on the conference table, and asks, "How are we supposed to know which feedback the kids need? I'm supposed to conference with 5 writers during the wording workshop today, and I have no idea what to say." The application of theory to classroom practices in diversity and student populations relies on the decision-making capacity of the teacher. In the scenario above that I have shared, Elizabeth has learned about the 4 levels of feedback that have potential to transform her students' writing and improve her benchmark scores. Now, she must decide how to apply the principles of feedback to her student writing products and processes. Of course, I made up that story, but it represents the culmination of things that I hear all of the time. As a matter of fact, this really started with Robbie's paper. I knew Robbie, and this is how his writing began. After I had a conversation with his teacher about how to help him, we talked about how we could set some really specific goals for him, as well as how we could use the levels of feedback to take him to the next place in his writing. Within about 2 months, this is the change in his writing. By November, this is what Robbie was doing. Clearly, something wonderful, something lovely is happening in the classroom with that teacher. We can see the change in Robbie's writing, but I'm not sure we can see what kinds of changes were happening in the teacher's thinking. And we certainly can't see what it was that she was doing to make such big changes in Robbie's writing. Dr. Kim talked about the kaleidoscope in her book, Narrative Inquiry. And when I think about the classroom, I can't imagine a more beautiful form to look at. And I think also it provides the perfect vehicle to structure my proposal. Good research design comes with well-crafted research questions. So, how do teachers determine which types of feedback are going to help their students the most? Because after all, that's what students are trying to do, is solve their writing dilemmas. How do teachers then evaluate the effectiveness of their feedback in ways that improve their teaching practice? One of the things that was really helpful to me this semester was learning about macro, meso, and micro levels of theoretical frameworks. It made a lot of sense to me to think at a holistic level about what lenses do I use to interpret, which really connected back to the kaleidoscope metaphor. Each one of these lenses colors how we view the research product and process. And all of these levels must intersect and connect well so that we can examine the research questions more fully. In terms of the macro lenses to conceptualize this study, I feel like hermeneutical phenomenology is an excellent choice. This is how I will be able to look at what the teacher is doing, where she lives in the classroom. I think that writing is a cognitive process of solving problems. So the teacher's thinking and metacognition are the phenomena that may reveal insights into how a teacher can. At the meso level, the methodology level, I consider what concepts I'm going to use the problem. And since this course is about narrative inquiry, that's the framework I've chosen to proceed. In returning to the metaphor of the kaleidoscope, the inside of the mirrors of the kaleidoscope really help reflect and help us see the phenomena that we wish to study. One of the reasons I've selected qualitative inquiry is that Emig is my superhero. Whenever she discovered her insights about composition, she used qualitative inquiry. She taught to students, actual students, as they were composing, to think aloud about how they were making their decisions. It was one of the first instances of using case study in this way, and I think that it is a replicable design for what I have in mind in listening to the teacher about how she's making decisions. Another reason to use qualitative inquiry is that researchers believe that it is a good model to use whenever you're studying composition, such as I am. The reason why I think also that it fits is because there are so many variables going on in a classroom. The lived reality of the teacher requires a naturalistic, context-dependent study to be able to capture the nuances of what's going on. Part of the reason I think that arts-based research with narrative inquiry is that English teachers have some really strongly held beliefs. A lot of times they don't want to let go of them. I believe that writing the research in such a way that a teacher can imagine themselves as the protagonist, explaining the realities of their classroom, I think that'll be interesting to a teacher, and I think it'll be persuasive to them. Teaching is really the story of people and how we interact with them. So I think that methodologically, narrative inquiry is a vehicle that can help me collect all of those stories to be able to help others as well as the person in the study to come to a greater understanding about what it is that they're doing in teaching. Another reason is the questions why and what and how. We know a lot of times what research says works. We don't have any problem as teachers understanding why we need to do that and the value of it. The problem comes whenever we begin to examine how do you go about making that happen with your kids, with your class, with your school. And so I think that narrative inquiry allows us to examine and go deeper into how the teacher gets that work done. So, for the proposed study, I will ask the teacher to do a think aloud about how she goes about making those decisions, just the way Emig did whenever she was looking at the students and about their composing processes. Talking to the teacher and examining how she goes about making those decisions should be an insightful way of examining how we make decisions about writing. I think also it is respectful of the people and the students that the teacher has. There are things about kids that are different than anybody else experiences, and this is a way to honor the stories of the children the teacher serves as well as the teacher herself. Most of the time whenever I tell people that I'm an English teacher, they don't want to talk to me anymore, and they certainly don't want me to read what they've written in a text message or an email. But I have to be honest, that is the content and the language in which I think. So, in the literature review, there are certain elements of content level expertise that I think are applicable in the study. First of all, you've already heard about my hero, Janet Emig. She examined how do people compose, and she used the approach of case study to directly get feedback from the participants as they composed. In the same way, I want to examine what the teacher is doing as she begins to work with kids in their composing processes. I think that that's going to give us insight in the same way that Emig did, that Emig found how writers develop. I think using the same research methodology and content approach, we can determine how teachers develop and begin to understand more complexity in how they give feedback to their students. I also think that we have to be honest that writing as a process is the pedagogy under which this takes place, and it has been shown to be effective in helping students, especially those who struggle. Since the proposed study really looks at how the teacher interacts with the students, really looking at the composing processes as a cognitive apprenticeship between the teacher and the student is an effective way of going about looking at the feedback approach that the teacher is using for the students. The importance of this study with Gersten and Baker makes the critical link between how one composes and the feedback one receives. It's the common vocabulary through the composing process that allows the teacher to be able to communicate with students in a meaningful way. It's about the dialogue that results in having the student create a product that's better than they started with. Most of the time we think about feedback as something that the teacher is giving to the student, but Hattie found that really it was more important for the teacher to take the feedback from the student that gave her the reason she needed to act on the information. And so in this study, it is the teacher that is taking the feedback to confirm, add to, overwrite, tune, or restructure information in her memory about how she goes about supporting the student writer. I also think, too, that it's been established that feedback is about a continual process. It's a loop that starts with something that already has happened. So in other words, the student's going to begin with an experience in learning. The teacher will respond to that. Then the child acts by creating a revision in the process of their writing. And then the teacher then takes that feedback again to evaluate the effectiveness of her impact that will then change how she relates to that student the next time she meets with them. All in all, it becomes a way, a method for the teacher to bridge the gap between what students are able to do and understand and where they need to go next. This proposal is seeking to examine how this teacher experienced that whole feedback loop and process. So how am I going to go about studying this approach? To me, this is where everything gets really interesting, because it's about how are we going to go about figuring out this. It's when we actually get to do the work. Whose story will I be telling? The proposed study will tell the story of one teacher. One high school teacher at a Panhandle school has agreed to participate in the study. She's going to be teaching freshman English and pre-AP English. This 9 through 12 school serves about 1,000 students, with primarily Hispanic students, which their percentage is over the state average. 52% of this population qualifies for free and reduced lunch programs, and the district struggles with a 76% graduation rate, which is 7% lower than the state average. I really have a close relationship with this teacher. I've been her instructional coach for the last 2 years and have been a regular visitor in our classroom, usually once a month. During those visits, we have team taught, collaborated to create lessons, and really have worked closely to solve specific problems with students. She's attended quite a few of the trainings I offer at her school, as well as the service center where I work. We communicate regularly through email and Facebook Messenger about her lessons and how students are or are not progressing with the strategies and approaches we are considering. Her personal characteristics also make her a perfect candidate for this study. She has no qualms about telling me that I'm wrong. Therefore, we're able to have deep conversations and work through differences in ideas and perceptions. In addition, this teacher is also a writer, a practitioner of the concept we seek to explore. She keeps a blog and reflects on our practices and her personal life. Her writing is raw and truthful and, frankly, insightful. Her written reflections are already artfully constructed, and it is likely that large excerpts of her prose will inform the study. It will be her voice and metacognition that will be the greatest source of data for the study. Secondary participants will also be involved. The teacher participant will select a HALO group of students for writing conferences. The HALO group of students will be comprised of students the teacher believes to fit the categories of this acronym: high, average, low, and other, which she'll choose between an English language learner or a special education student. A detailed demographic profile of the students and the teacher will be available. The teacher, principal, students, and guardians will all complete consent and assent forms prior to the participation in the study. I think it's important to note that I do want to use students as secondary participants because I want to keep the decision-making of the teacher in the forefront of the study. I do not want to develop information or understanding about the students that the teacher does not have at her disposal. There are multiple data sources that will be used in this study: student writing samples, interviews, observations, and artifacts. Several student-written documents will be collected. The first one will be the benchmark, the beginning writing assessment that the student will compose. This is the one that the teacher will think aloud through about how she's going to begin feedback for the student. The second document collected will be how the student chooses to revise the paper. And then third, a final copy of the student's writing will be collected. I'm calling this section interviews, but it's more like the teacher thinking aloud through her process of making decisions. The first interview will happen when the teacher takes the first written sample of the student's writing. It's then that she'll think through what she's doing and what she's about to do when she meets in a conference with the student. The second time I will speak to the teacher will be after she has had the conference with the student. And then the third time is we'll interview and discuss things whenever the student has given her back the revisions or the final copy from the conference that they had. A neat idea that came up in the research study for the background of this proposal was an idea by McCormick. He suggested that when you're through with an interview, that you sit down and you write a story to begin the interpretive process after you finish the interview. This sounds like the perfect opportunity for narrative inquiry for the teacher and I to sit down together and begin the meaning-making and decision-making process about how we're going to understand what happened during the interactions with the students and during her think aloud. An observation will be critical to the study as well. After the teacher has had a chance to think aloud through how she is going to respond to the student writer, I need to look at what actually happens whenever she responds to the writer. During that process, I'll take a video that focuses on the space in between the teacher and the student, probably focusing on the paper and any sticky notes or drawings that take place during the conference. From that data, I'll be able to transcribe or code them for thematic analysis and use them for creating the story of how the teacher goes through their thinking. Inevitably, writing instruction comes with a lot of stuff. Sticky notes, drafts, things written on a board, lots of things that will be available in the classroom can help add to the story of the teacher's thinking and the elements that she uses to support the student. Frankly, I know myself. I'm going to have to keep a running timeline of actions, documents, decisions, conversations. I'm going to have to really put all of that together in one place so that I can find and trace my thinking throughout the process. Sometimes you don't remember, and those notes are going to be able to trigger some of the memories and help bring together some insights that I might miss without it. I also think this is a key piece in being trustworthy and reliable so that I can really trust what it is that is coming from the research. One of the neat things that I found about was from Gilliland. She believed that there were elements that you could see in writing that were tracers. In other words, whenever I listened to the teacher do her think aloud, some of those elements of her speech can be traced to the way she acts whenever she interacts with the student in the conference. Then I can also see if there are tracers that are found in the student's revisions that are then traced back to how the teacher evaluates her feedback and next steps with the writer. Alright, here I go for the guts and the glory. Let's see if I understood the elements in this course. As I was studying, I found Labov, and he looked at thematic organization that really helped you understand the major events and milestones. And I think that this is going to be the way I can conceptualize putting the story together. The evaluation model will situate the student's writing within the context of the writing conference with the teacher, and then it will frame the major headings for the rest of the story. So the student has problems to solve, so that's the complication feature that the teacher has to assist the student in solving. When the teacher makes the decisions about how to help the student, that is the evaluation or the so what portion of the narrative analysis. Then the teacher will then look at how her response to the student changed the student's writing. That will serve as the result in Labov's model. I'll conclude the narrative with the coda to bring the narrative to a close. This is the part where I'm not sure if I'm doing this correct or not. I'm using Labov's model to conceptualize how I'm thinking through the plot diagram, basically. But then I need a way of analyzing the narrative itself. And I'm thinking that Polkinghorne's method of where we analyze and interpret the collection of data as a story and then co-construct the themes with the teacher participant to figure out and name what it is that she did to give feedback to the student. Polkinghorne also talks about how you take data and then you turn it into a story. And so what I would like to do in this instance is take a vignette for each one of the students and create a little story about the student that was a high student. And then the teacher's thinking about that and how she solved the problems for the student and evaluated the impact of her feedback. I'm not really sure if you can do both analysis of narrative and construction of narrative, but I think that putting it together in that way might make some sense about how I go about analyzing it, as well as how I go about writing it up for the final paper. I really did like the way Ronai put together her essay of putting the stories first and then talking about what it meant and the connections in the reader research. I also liked how Kim and Zimmerman kept large swaths of the teacher's story and as a coherent whole, and then went through and determined what the findings were and followed with discussion and implications for research and practice. That's something that I really have to think through of what it's going to finally look like. Next, I'll describe a brief section of the limitations and the significance of the study. I think the eyepiece for the kaleidoscope is a really good metaphor for the limitations in this study. I'll be looking through my own point of view and trying to see what the teacher is doing. Yes, I'm going to work with her to try to figure out and check to make sure things are going well, but I'll be limited with my perspective and the realities of who I am. I think another limitation is that this teacher and I have worked very closely, and it's almost a form of backyard research, and I'll have to be very careful about how I conduct the research and continue the relationship with this teacher. You know, we know what works in education from research. We have a lot of numbers that tell us what kind of decisions that we need to be making, but I'm not sure that that tells us how to do it. And so I'm hoping that working with this teacher, I can learn about more how she goes about making decisions with feedback. But I'm hoping that there are going to be some other elements in that that might be generalizable to other people in how they make decisions for instruction as well.